Welcome to No One is Competent. Do you want to see a bunch of emancipated slaves kicking everybody's asses? Alright, let's do it. This is the premier history podcast about how empires fail to keep any control over what they want. I am Azalea, joined, of course, by Jay. You can find us on Twitter at Azalea Wyatt and at Jaharis48. You can contact the podcast at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. Please hit us up if you have podcast suggestions or questions you want us to answer. You can also ask us those questions in our YouTube comment section if you are there. You should also like and subscribe. Likewise, whether you're listening to us on Spotify, on Apple, on Anchor, on any podcasting platform, we greatly appreciate you reviewing, liking, starring, striking, however the algorithm lets you interact with it. It helps out the show immensely because we have no ads, no sponsors. The deep state hasn't even fucking answered my calls and pleadings for money in the last 58 days, okay? I think this time they cut me off for good. Jay, have you been getting deep state emails? Are they responding to you? I've left them like 15 voicemails and
they've reached out, but I've just kind of been ghosting them. You gotta.
Oh, you too good for the deep state now?
Yeah, you gotta leave them on red for a little while until they come back with a better offer.
All right, well, I'll let you handle our financial dealings and have complete confidence that you'll be giving me my equal 50% cut of whatever you negotiate.
Listen, all I'm saying is that, if we can get access to at least one geosynchronous spy satellite, then we're talking.
All right, actual factual, completely unrelated question before we jump into the podcast, just because this is in the fucking news. Am I just 14 IQ, or why does China need to put a balloon over Montana? Why can they not just use Google Maps? Are there not satellites? Do they need that much better a camera? Does this really give them information they don't already have?
I mean, you could probably get better resolution than you can with commercial satellites, and China doesn't have as many spy satellites as the United States has. So I can see some value in it. Having it drift over Montana or whatever seems kind of pointless. I've heard some theories that's more just for domestic politics. Balloon. Yeah, it's, some people said maybe it was an accident, or maybe it was just for domestic political reasons or whatever. But they have been using balloons for surveillance for a while now, and again, they don't have as many satellites as the U.S., probably not as good in terms of image resolution as the U.S., so balloons can be a pretty cheap way of compensating for that to a degree.
I can just type in Bozeman, Montana, Google Earth right now.
Yeah.
And be there.
If you ever want to see what spy satellite imagery looks like, Trump, when he was president, tweeted that shot of an Iranian rocket launch site. And when you look at that, you realize, oh, this is way better than Google Earth or Google Maps. So that is, I guess, what they are trying to achieve through a different means.
Have you ever looked at, your town on Google Earth and, just gotten mad? They've either mislabeled something or or the order of importance of things. As you zoom out and you zoom in, obviously certain things become, leave. And if you zoom in, it's oh, now we can show you more specifics. And you get a little upset.
I can't say that I've ever been too upset at Google Maps now.
Or sometimes, like, I'm not gonna totally dox myself, but, like, I'm currently looking at my town on Google Maps and seeing a place that's very near where I live that, like, that's not a real place. I don't fucking care what municipality. No one calls it. No one uses that name. No one calls it that. No one has that name in their repertoire. That's not a real town. That may have a post office, but that is not. That ain't fuck. Don't fuck with me, man. Don't.
Maybe everybody calls it that, and you're just the odd one out.
I was wondering what it was going to take to get you back into gaslighting. Yeah, see, like, I'm just now looking at Nehart, Montana. Looks like a small little affair all around the Belt Creek. Oh, they've got this place called Compromise Gulch. Well, isn't that inventive? Hopefully there were no war crimes committed around there. They had to kind of, what are we compromising over? Honestly, could be very dark or hilariously benign. It is Montana.
Yeah. I was gonna say, if it's in the that region of the United States, you can probably bet that there were some war crimes committed there in the latter half of the 1800s.
Well, it's not like the Dakotas, okay? It's not like Nebraska.
Yeah. But I don't know if that has anything to do with the name or not. Probably not. It's probably something innocuous.
I think the most violent shit ever happened in Montana was, like, labor wars shit, like in the 19-teens.
I guess, yeah. I don't know too much
Shout out
about
to the podcast
Montana
Death
history.
in the West, which everyone listening to this should listen to. But speaking of death in the West, you know where else people died, Jay?
Where?
The former colony of Saint-Domingue.
Indeed, which also happens to be in the West, at least relative to Europe.
I mean, it's a fucking globe. Everything is
Yeah.
west, everything is east. Directions are gay.
Yeah. There is a West to everywhere.
I don't know if, because I'm still on Google Earth and I'm just like looking at Haiti now. I don't know if I fully appreciated how weirdly shaped Haiti is.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of odd-shaped.
40% of the country is a peninsula that's very long and not very stout. You can definitely see even with we've spoken about how the infrastructure was built in such a way that wasn't really facilitating overland movement of people from one town to another, just from plantation to ports. But even if it was, this place would be hard to get around.
Yeah.
Even minus all of the jungle and mountainous terrain.
It's definitely unusual geography. I mean, we'll have the map of the island, I'm sure, up again. But I remember when I first looked at it, and, there were 3 provinces during the French period: the North, the West, and the South. And the South province is to the west of the West province. Because the South province, yeah, because it's that bottom peninsula jutting all the way out.
By the way, I believe Cap Francais is now Cap Haitien, if are looking at
oh yeah, they
Haiti
renamed it a few
Google
times.
Maps.
It was like Cap the Liberty, Libertad, or whatever, I think, during the Revolution for a few years, but yeah. It got renamed a few amount of times. A lot of places in Haiti have been renamed for obvious reasons.
Duncan calls it Le Cap in his podcast series just to make things extra confusing.
That was the name that most people used in the time. Most people would just say Le Cap. So that is also correct.
Yeah, Duncan really likes using like the things that people then called stuff, which leads him to when he's doing the Russian Revolution using all of the times and dates that were wrong because the Russians were using the wrong ass fucking calendar for fucking hundreds of years because the entire country is a bunch of dumbass fucking donkey motherfuckers. I don't even fucking and like, I'm sorry, I have so much fucking respect for that man. That's just the wrong decision. That's just no. Just, why?
Really cashing in on the "it's okay to hate the Russians" card in 2023.
God, I love being racist, Jay. It's so fun. I understand why people did it. It's just relaxing.
All right, I will have no comment on this matter, other than to say that if we have any Russian listeners, I don't think we do, but thank you for listening, and
I have great admiration for the Russians. We did an entire episode about Russian victory and overcoming great offense. They are a very industrious people. Listen, I have spent many an evening with vodka in various capacities, in various states of tears coming out of my eyes, in various states of Jay mocking me because he's an asshole.
You are a Georgian, which means that if you squint hard enough, you are a Slav.
Yes. Fair. Fair and valid. I'm not even going to contest that point. Okay. So this is part 2 of our Haitian Revolution podcast. We split this into 2 parts for time and then proceeded to banter for, 27 minutes just to bulk up the episode. Last time we spoke about how the colony of Saint-Domingue came about, how it was set up, the various factions and socio-economic factors, the nature of slavery in the colony, and we kind of did everything right up to 1793. If you didn't listen to that one, go listen to that one, or do something else that would improve your life, and I ain't your daddy. We also, in that podcast, spent some time talking about modern-day Haiti and what happened to Haiti after the revolution, if you have any questions about that. So today, because we have no burden of context, we can get straight to the killing people, which is what y'all are here for. But to set our stage, remind us where we are, let's just go over our main players. So Jay, is it fair to say that on the eve of our last episode, we had, say, 3 main-ish factions, kind of, right? The North had broken out into lots of slave revolts, now freeman revolts, and those are organized under various leaders, and they're not super unified. There's a guy in there, Toussaint Louverture, but he's not really important or well known at this point. There's a government that has been formed, all whites, representing the rich white landowners, that is kind of negotiating a little bit with the slaves. And then there is a white and colored rebel faction in the southwest?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, I got it. And meanwhile, the War of the First Coalition is breaking out in Europe, and France is changing governments once every 10-ish months or so. So who are the boys being sent from Paris to sort this whole mess out and return Saint-Domingue to the colony of peace, prosperity, sugar, and chopping up African bodies that it's, quote, supposed to be.
Right. So that would be the second civil commission. There was a first. You don't really have to worry about it because it didn't get much done. But this would be led by two Jacobins, Etienne Polverel and, I'm going to butcher every French name,
Léger Félicité Sontenax.
Yes. And really, it's Sontenax who's going to kind of be the leading guy of the two. So he's the important one.
Like everyone cool, I spent approximately 5,000 hours of 2022 playing Elden Ring. And in that game, written partially by George R.R. Martin, all of the dragons have a name ending in AXX. So there's Grandsax, Larsenax, Paladusax, and when I see Sontenax, that's the only thing in my head. The only thing I can think of is a giant red lightning wielding dragon.
Yeah, if you ever look up a portrait of him, maybe he is a dragon. I don't know. They just got the painter got it wrong. But yeah. So basically, we have this thing going on, the French Revolution, and given the ideals that you probably associate with the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, you might expect that the black and colored population of Saint-Domingue would be sympathetic to this. Those are good things for them. In reality, the situation was a bit more complex. Yeah, the French Revolution was not necessarily seen as a welcome occurrence by those people rebelling. And that's because a lot of the white colonists were enthusiastic supporters of the revolution. White militia flying the tricolor had massacred slaves and free men of color alike. And a lot of the uprising leaders were also very religious. Many of them were either Catholic or, what we call voodoo, which is sort of like a synchronous religion of both Christianity and Native African beliefs. And many of them espoused royalist sentiments prior to the revolution, because the royal authority was basically one of the few moderating forces, at least on paper, standing in opposition to the brutality of white plantation owners.
This is incredibly common in feudal or post-feudal societies, where serfs or slaves or peasants will hate the local nobles, but venerate the king or the czar or whatever, because it's like, if the king knew about our plight, he would surely come and right this. Or simply because the king, much like a god, and the king is so far off they might as well be a god, is just this authority figure that you're allowed to like, that you can sort of plead to, either literally or just in your kind of prayers and hopes, would interdict on your behalf. So this is very common.
Yeah. I mean, in Russia, people even call this, the good czar phenomena. The idea is like it's the middle management, it's the nobles and the landowners who are evil, and the king is our friend. And this went so far as George Bassot, who's one of the leaders of the rebellion in the north, was saying that he would die fighting for King Louis XVI when he heard that Louis XVI had been imprisoned. And this means that Polverel and Sontenax were thus presented with a pretty difficult political situation when they landed in Saint-Domingue. They kind of had to sort things out with a bunch of different factions divided not just by their race and class, but also by their politics.
And we're not going to fully go into it, but surely there are fucking royalist, conservative, white plantation owner there's plantation owner colonists who are fan of the revolutionary government.
We're kind of glossing over this. There are a lot of different factions in this, but we kind of mentioned in the last episode, but there was a royalist governor, a white governor, who also kind of gets in skirmishes with the pro-revolution whites early on, and he's eventually kind of kicked out. But there are a lot of divisions all over the place.
this is the No One is Competent podcast, but I think we've highlighted this before, but one of the many reasons that no one is competent is that people are given jobs that literally no one could fix this situation. No two people could sort this shit out. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
That's not on the table. So shortly after their arrival in Saint-Domingue, the civil commissioners were faced by an uprising of white citizens in Cap Français, who were opposed to the Legislative Assembly's decision to grant full rights to free men of color. Remember that the white colonists and the colonists of color have been fighting, and people have been sometimes dying in the last 2 years over this detail. Order was only restored thanks to the help of colored militia, convincing the commissioners that an alliance with the freemen of color was necessary for maintaining order in the colony. Together, the French army of the commissioners and the colored-led forces were able to launch a series of offenses in early 1793 that succeeded in recapturing a significant amount of territory across the island. This is capturing territory back from the freemen.
Yeah. As well as some whites who had still opposing them.
They effectively pushed the rebels in the north into Spanish-controlled Santo Domingo. Now remember that that side of the island is far less populous, so it's not like if they go over there, the Spanish are immediately going to jump on them or even fully know they're there. There's mountains and wild lands that Maroons have been hiding out in for decades. Now this would prove just be a brief respite, as the main black rebels, Jean-François, Georges Bissot, and Toussaint Louverture, soon found themselves allied with and being supplied by, drumroll, Spain, because the War of the First Coalition is going on, and France has enemies, including Britain, who is right over there in Jamaica.
Yeah, not a great situation for the French. This is, this is where, if you haven't listened to it, you should also listen to our episode on the War of the First Coalition. But basically, they're kind of at war with everyone at the moment.
Yeah, so now Sontenax and Palvarel have to fight slaves that are not just fighting with shit that they stole from plantations, but now potentially guns and weaponry and stuff that they've gotten from the Spanish.
Yes.
They're probably not getting the good shit, but it ain't helping.
Yeah. And the situation became even worse for the commissioners in May of 93, when they found out that the newly arrived governor of Saint-Domingue, General Francois Thomas Galbaud, was attempting to reverse their policies.
All right, now explain to me the relationship between the commissioners and the governor. Why do you need commissioners and a governor? That doesn't make much sense to me. Who's on top?
The governor is like the executive, he's the guy who's like in charge of the actual running of the colony. Whereas the commissioners they have like investigatory powers. They're kind of like in temporary control over the army as well. It's kind of modeled after how like the Jacobins would send these commissioners in France to rebellious towns and cities and stuff to kind of sort things out.
They're kind of like the civilian equivalent of political officers.
Yeah,
they're like special executives that have been sent in on emergency authority that hypothetically is not permanent and regular.
Yeah, but they do have authority over the governor because, the commissioners are acting basically on the behalf of the government back in Paris. But this guy is basically just ignoring them and reinstating, the racial divisions. So the commissioners arrest Galbaud, but he ends up being freed by a bunch of French sailors who mutiny, and they proceed to lead an assault on Cap François. Because the French army was still scattered throughout the colony, Sontenax and Polverel ended up having to rely on a force around 2,000 black insurgents to recapture the city.
This part is
Now,
great.
Yeah, in order to win their support, of course, they had to promise them their freedom. Because, why else would they fight for the French otherwise?
And this is one of the fun parts of a conflict with like a dozen different factions and hundreds, if you actually understand it, is that people can just sort of like turn around and say, "All right, hey, you hate this guy. Let's make a deal." 15 minutes later, okay, yeah. So I'm done with this guy now. Y'all want to talk?
Yeah. Now this smaller act of emancipation would soon be followed by an even larger one. Because with the Spanish-backed rebels threatening to overrun the colony from the north, the commissioners soon realized that their only way to keep hold of their colony was complete emancipation. They had to get the black population on their side. This meant that on August 29th, Sonthonax issued a decree emancipating the slaves in the northern province of Saint-Domingue, followed shortly by further decrees emancipating those in the west and south. Saint-Domingue's black population was thus now entirely free in the eyes of the law.
Jay, I think you share my opinion that when reading into this, Sonthonax is a much more competent figure than we, or at least I, initially anticipated him to be.
Yeah.
Because he's the outsider, right? He's brought in, and he's not, he's white, but he's not fully embroiled in these conflicts of race and class. He's trying to get this shit nailed down. And he looks at the map, and he looks at the map of everyone fighting him and why everyone's fighting everyone else, and the slave rebellions and the coloreds and the whites and who wants what and who's in what city and the Spanish coming over, and he says the only way we could even start to making this math work is if the blacks aren't fighting us.
Yeah.
If 90% of the population isn't just default against us because we're trying to enslave them.
Yeah.
And it's not and like, doesn't require, you don't have to be 2,600 ELO in chess to make that guess, but it's not a dumb move.
Yeah. He's kind of my favorite Jackman after reading, after doing the research for these episodes. He's very much, reacting to things, just going around trying to put out fires, but he does a better job than, I think anybody else could have realistically hoped for.
Yes. Now, of course, that better job than anyone could have hoped for is still pretty bad.
Yeah.
Because, and this is one of my favorite parts of the story, the trouble with emancipation, this is what we tried to harp on the entire last episode, was that Saint-Domingue's economy was entirely based on slavery. Slavery was planned for it from pretty much near the jump. It only works because of slavery. You cannot make this much sugar and coffee without this much exploited labor. Where are you going to get the money? This place only exists to make money. Without money, you might as well not have it. So Sonthonax, what are you going to do? So Sonthonax says, all right, listen. This isn't just a full abolishment of slavery. We're recategorizing, and we will no longer have any slaves. Instead, you are now cultivators. And there's no drivers, no slave drivers, no whip. But of course there will be conductors of the labor that is needed. And the cultivators, of course, must return to their original plantations, but they will be now paid. You can't leave for a while. You can't. That would be crazy. But you will be paid something. We promise. We don't know what it is, but you'll be paid. And that was his deal. That was the offer.
Yeah.
So Jay, what did the now freedmen with the guns and Spain's backing and quickly realizing their ability to organize and fight for themselves, what did they say to that offer?
No, basically.
Yeah, they were like, you want us to go back to the old masters, especially the ones that, like, maybe we, like, killed some of their family members or them. Yeah, that's just going to be awkward. No. The commission's decree was symbolically significant, but it could not immediately reverse the tide of the war. You can't just say slavery is over, and especially this is not saying slavery is over. This is saying slavery is over with 15,000 caveats, and think everybody's going to be fine and dandy after decades of oppression and people being literally blown up. In the north, Spanish-backed black forces had taken over much of the province, save the big city of Cap Francais and its surroundings. The British, meanwhile, have landed and captured much of the west and the south, often being invited into towns by their white residents who probably think that Frontenac and the revolutionary government are insane for freeing the slaves and taking the side of the coloreds and being against the king and shit. And remember, this is 1794, where the terror is fucking ramping up, and it is looking bad. But 1794 was a chaotic year. Britain's invading forces get completely ravished by disease because it's Haiti, preventing them from making further advances. Meanwhile, in the north, there's infighting between the Spanish-backed black generals because they've never been fully organized or really had a chain of command. So there's danger all around, but no one is fully threatening to take the colony.
Yeah. It did kind of amuse me that this is kind of like a microcosm of the War of the First Coalition, where everything is going wrong for France, and then...
And they don't lose.
Yeah. They will lose eventually, but not now.
It's like the Monty Python Quest of the Holy Grail, like the guy with all of his limbs lopped off. I'm not dead yet.
Yeah.
It's just like how much can go wrong and you're still trying to pull this out.
Yeah. On February 4th, 1794, the National Convention in France declared a formal end to slavery in all of France's colonies, and that all men living in the colonies were French citizens. This decree confirmed the commissioners' emancipation and likely played a role in convincing Toussaint Louverture to switch sides and join the French in May of that year. Now, by that point, Toussaint had grown to be the most capable and powerful of the generals in the north, meaning that his change in allegiances basically brought about an end to the Spanish threat. Anyways, that wouldn't really matter much because Spain itself would make peace with France in the following year. Now, Poverel and Frontenac would return to France that year, leaving a gap in the island's politics that would be filled by the new military governor who's been sent over, a guy named General Laveaux, as well as Toussaint.
And that would probably be sent over by the Prairial governments after the terror. Remember, French Revolution, shifting sands. I have a lot of speculation in my head about Toussaint and wondering how much of his switching to the French side is a desire to beat out the other black commanders that were on the Spanish side and sort of consolidate, carve out a space for him to dominate and take a full leadership role. He was a highly ambitious man, and in the years following 1794, he would maneuver himself to the top of the power structure in Saint-Domingue, primarily by making himself invaluable to the French in two areas: defeating the British and ensuring French authority. While Britain's early advance had waned due to disease, in 1796 they launched another offensive, landing over 10,000 men on the island. His invasion would prove to be even more disastrous than the first, however, as well-led black forces under Toussaint, Pétion, and Rigaud proved capable of fighting the British as equals. Disease once again took its toll, wiping out the majority of British forces. The following year, Britain began finally withdrawing from Saint-Domingue and abandoned their plans to conquer the colony. While taking part in the defeat of the British raised Toussaint's stock even further, it was another event coinciding with his campaign that elevated him above the other generals. Since 1794, Toussaint had cultivated a close relationship with General Laveaux. That's that new military governor that's replacing Sontenax. Always making sure to portray himself as a faithful subordinate to the general and a loyal subject of France. Laveaux, in turn, had come to rely on Toussaint due to his clear skill in both war and politics. This is clearly a guy who knows to talk to anyone. Toussaint is a guy who has had to walk into a camp of rebelling slaves around a fire and speak tactics. And he's a guy who's had to walk into a powdered room filled with tobacco smoke and speak sweet nothing into the ears of fat dignitaries.
Yeah, I think he even refers to Laveaux as a father in letters and stuff like that. He's kind of sucking up to him.
Yeah, well, he politically promotes himself over other generals, and in April of 96, one of those generals, Jean-Louis Villatte, stages a coup in Cap Français, seizing Laveaux and declaring himself to be governor of the colony. Villatte, who was himself a free man of color prior to the revolution, claimed that France was secretly planning on reinstating slavery in Saint-Domingue. Toussaint raced back with his army to the capital, forced Villatte to release Laveaux and surrender, and made a show of investigating this conspiracy and debunking it, which is definitely probably important for his free black army. And for his efforts, he was made deputy governor of Saint-Domingue by Laveaux. Not by Paris, but by Laveaux. And what I'm seeing here is that France, during the War of the First Coalition, is getting control back of Saint-Domingue. Really not by any action of themselves, but by the action of the black armies, the black generals, the black soldiers, and Toussaint eventually becomes the most prominent of that faction. They have not retaken Saint-Domingue.
Yeah.
The black armies have retaken Saint-Domingue.
Yes.
It's just that you are allied with the black armies now, and everything's cool.
Yes.
If in the future, hypothetically, you were not,
Yeah. So at this point, in Saint-Domingue, you basically have three guys at the top of the political pyramid. Toussaint, Laveaux, and Sontenax. Sontenax came back as a part of a third civil commission in 1796. Toussaint, however, did not want to be subject to any higher French authority in the colony, and therefore he set about ridding himself of the latter two men. Now his opportunity came when it was time to decide on Saint-Domingue's representatives to the newly formed Council of Ancients in France. Toussaint lobbied heavily for Laveaux and Sontenax to be appointed in the role. Laveaux accepted it without much hesitation and went back to France in 1796. Frankly, I would have done the same if I was in this position. That sounds like a lot nicer thing to do than risk dying of yellow fever in Saint-Domingue. But Sontenax, gets appointed to the council as well, but he basically says, no, I'm going to remain here for a little while. Until Toussaint kind of kicks him out by force. Strongly encourages him to leave. Now, with their departures, Toussaint was made Governor General of Saint-Domingue, marking the first time in the colony's history that it was formally led by a black man. Now, we've been talking quite a bit about politics and war and whatever, so it's worth taking a brief aside to take a look at exactly how the people of Saint-Domingue were getting along by this point in the story.
Yeah, we've sort of skipped ahead a little bit. And the Haitian Revolution is weird because it's like, fucking 93 to 96. And then 1801 happened, and you're like, whoa,
Yeah.
calm down there.
Yeah. Yeah, with the departure of the British in 1797, the people of Saint-Domingue were finally given a brief period of respite to pick themselves up and try to rebuild their society. Now, eventually, a lot of former slaves did return to work on plantations, though in the absence of formal owners, a lot of the land of the colony was effectively taken over by small farmers, and this would mark a transition towards the small-scale peasant agriculture that would dominate the island in the coming centuries, really up until today in a lot of areas.
And this makes complete sense, right? Remember, the slaves had to feed themselves.
Yeah.
While they were slaves, they know how to do that. They knew how to sustain themselves. It might be lean, but it works. And they're going to organize themselves the way they find the ways natural to organize themselves, which isn't necessarily commercial or capitalistic or industrial in scale.
Yeah. Now, the colony by this point was highly militarized, with various generals commanding their own armies, the largest of which numbered in the tens of thousands. You know, people don't really use the term in this instance, but like they're kind of like warlords. Basically, you have these individual figures who build up their own followings of officers and men, and you know, command them through their own skills and charisma.
Sure. Today in Haiti, they call them gang leaders.
Yeah. Now, this high degree of militarization would prove vital in defeating the French a few years down the line, but it also deprived the country of a significant chunk of its labor force, a state of affairs made worse by the habit of soldiers to simply take whatever they wanted from the civilian population. Education remained basically non-existent outside of the cities, and resentment between the three main racial groups on the island remained strong. That being said, both French colonial officials and foreign visitors did note that Saint-Domingue was slowly starting to rebuild itself into a functioning society during these years.
In spite of his liberal pretensions, the government Toussaint sought to establish in Saint-Domingue can be characterized as an authoritarian military state. We haven't been talking about elections yet. Toussaint and his cadre of loyal officers and officials, including both black and white members, were in complete control. And again, you gotta remember that there's plenty of factions, colored factions, white factions, old white royalist factions, maybe even different black leader factions that would, I'm sure in Toussaint's mind, thinks if I slip at all, they're gonna jump on me.
Yeah.
And so, we're ruling with the iron fist. Under his new government, agriculture was seen as duty, akin to military service. Anyone who could not prove their skill in a particular profession was designated as a farmer and assigned a plantation to work on. Farmers could not leave their plantations to seek work elsewhere without government approval. This is very similar to what Sontenax was proposing in 93, which was rejected. These measures succeeded in boosting agrarian productivity, with coffee production reaching 60% of its pre-revolution figure by 1801, which, considering all the damage that was done probably to the infrastructure and whatnot, really, and the fact that no new slaves have been imported really shows that beating people and slavery is not an effective way to increase productivity.
Yeah.
Just does not economically work very well.
Yeah.
A major threat to Toussaint's authority came in the form of André Rigaud and Alexandre Pétion, two powerful colored generals who dominated politics in the southern province. Remember, these guys were kind of rebelling on their own and then sort of came into the fold, but they still have their military power and their political clout. So in order to eliminate this threat, Toussaint launched an invasion of the South in 1799, sparking a conflict that would become known as the War of the Knives. The War of the Knives would prove to be a short but bloody campaign. After some initial setbacks, Toussaint's forces, led primarily by his top generals, Henri Christophe and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, keep an eye on that one, achieved victory in the South. They were aided by a rather unexpected ally, the United States, a result of Toussaint pledging to President John Adams that he would prevent French privateers from operating from the colony. I did not know that. That is kind of hilarious and awesome.
Yeah, this is a period where, if you remember from AP US history, the quasi-war between the US and France. The French privateers are raiding American merchant ships, and a lot of them are operating out of Saint-Domingue. So he's basically like, hey, I'll stop these privateers, and in exchange, the US Navy actually does send some ships. And they kind of blockade some of the cities and whatever and help Toussaint's forces.
Rare John Adams dub.
Yeah. And this show also shows that Toussaint's like interacting with foreign governments. He's he's writing to the President of the United States. He's also even entering negotiations with the British, also agreeing to prevent privateering of their ships from, privateers operating out of Saint-Domingue in exchange for reopening trade with those countries. Now, this, of course, is basically undermining French foreign policy completely because he's acting as a head of state in his own right. France is at war with Britain. Now, Toussaint's most dramatic displays of independence would come in 1801, and there'd be two of them. The first was the invasion of Spanish-controlled Santo Domingo. Now, Santo Domingo had technically been ceded to France in 1795, but the French had refrained from occupying it. Toussaint went against the wishes of the French government and invaded the territory himself, easily overrunning the sparsely populated colony and uniting the entire island. The second was the promulgation of a constitution that, among other things, established Toussaint as a governor for life and gave him the authority to select his own successor.
Just call yourself king, man.
Yeah.
Governor for life who can select their own successor. That's a king. Do it.
Yeah.
Do it. Say you're the king of the island. Have some confidence in yourself.
Toussaint's... yeah. Toussaint's an interesting guy. Like, it's easy to see all this and just be like, oh yeah, he's just a dictator. He gets some power via revolution, and then he just wants to be in charge forever. Like, typical dictator stuff. And he calls himself a governor for life. That being said, I think you have to understand the context, which is, this is a guy who is born and raised in an authoritarian society. He's probably going to act like an authoritarian.
That's a very good point.
He's not going to AP government and learning about, balance of checks and balances and stuff. And one of his fears is that the French or somebody else will come and reestablish slavery. Hint, hint, that will happen. Or they'll try to make it happen. And that he needs a very strong state to resist that. So I don't want to whitewash him and be like, oh, Toussaint did nothing wrong. There are people who will do that. Toussaint has a lot of fans. But I also think you have to understand his actions in the context of the time.
So the Black armies defeat the Spanish, the British, the Coloreds, and now Toussaint has just taken control of the full island, and France is beginning to realize that, oh, we don't actually control the island. He controls the island.
Yeah.
So, regardless of Toussaint's motives throughout his years as governor of Saint-Domingue, what's clear is that the political acumen he displayed during his rise to power is giving way to heavy-handed, often unpopular authoritarianism. You think all those black freemen enjoy being back on those plantations, even without the whip? And the whip still may be there, in some places, a little less. Well, he had succeeded in crushing Rigaud and Pétion. In doing so, he alienated a significant portion of the colored population. His popularity with the black followers are, again, jeopardized by the strict labor practices, and many black farmers saw him as collaborating with white landowners to keep them oppressed, which was true.
Yeah.
He's kissing up to the former governor and calling him his son. He's attempting to join their class, if we were analyzing this from a class conflict point of view.
There, something which can be overlooked is that there are still a lot of white landowners in Haiti. And Toussaint will kind of like mess with the white people. Like, he'll do things like he'll summon them to meetings and then like be really late and just make them wait. But at the end of the day, he wants to work with them. He wants the whites to remain on Haiti and participate in the economy, which mostly means participating as middle and upper class, because that's what, the roles they filled.
Yeah, and there has been no Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There has been no punishments. There are still many open wounds. So, in 1801, a rebellion of farmers in the northern province broke out and was brutally put down by Toussaint. He also arrested and executed one of his closest supporters, General Moise, who had refused to take action against the rebels, saying that he did not want to be the, quote, executioner of his own color. Moise's death led to further distrust between Toussaint and his officers. Starting to see what side this guy is on. It's hardly an original observation that Toussaint's rise to power mirrored that of the man who would ultimately bring about his downfall, Napoleon Bonaparte. Like Napoleon, Toussaint had translated military victories into political capital, and like Napoleon, he set himself up as an increasingly autocratic ruler. Toussaint had been able to get away with his plans for some time due to the weakness of the French Directory, but with the rise of Napoleon in 1799, things began to change in France. Okay, wait, Jay, pause. Alright. For the nerds, for the dweebs, for the people who we shouldn't pay attention to. Within this time frame, within this early time frame, like ending in 1802, Napoleon or Toussaint, who impresses you more? Who you got? Who's your guy? Power levels.
I mean, in spite of everything that we're going to talk about in this episode, like, I am a partial Napoleon fanboy, but yeah,
it's close.
Both of them really impressive rises to power. Like, it is hard to argue against a black person becoming governor of a Caribbean colony in the 1700s.
I think the thing that you have to remember Napoleon, and he was incredibly brilliant in this period, but he was also a very, eventually rises to power because he's convenient for other people. He was kind of being used as a puppet, but then he just sort of flipped the table and became the puppet master. Whereas Toussaint just sort of through force of I have the army, pushed himself into controlling the entire island eventually.
Yeah.
We also have less writings of him being a fucking weeb.
Yeah. I think you make a fair argument that Toussaint's rise is more impressive than Napoleon's. I think once he's in power, Toussaint will make these decisions which kind of, jeopardize his own rule. I mean, we've talked about his approach to the coloreds and to the his black generals. Also his foreign policy, he pushes for a sort of alliance with the British, but the British are only interested in using him as so much as he's useful to them, and
Yeah.
I think he'll stop being useful to them pretty quickly. We'll go into that.
He seems a little more
he also,
hasty than Napoleon. He seems a little less talented at making the little guy love him.
Yeah. He'll also, he's speaking with the United States, and John Adams will give way to Thomas Jefferson, who will be much less positively disposed towards the Haitians than Adams,
how
for
surprising.
reasons I think a lot of people can't. Yeah.
I wonder why.
But he's in a very difficult situation. So I think, Toussaint's a very impressive historical figure, and kind of like Sontenax, but even more so. He does a lot of things right, and it's hard to imagine anybody doing better. But yeah, so speaking of Napoleon, when Napoleon Bonaparte came to power, it was not yet clear what his approach to the situation in Saint-Domingue would be. Now, on the surface, it would have seemed perfectly possible that he could simply let the colony be. Toussaint Louverture, after all, was technically ruling in the name of France, and early on in the consulate, Napoleon affirmed Toussaint's position as governor of Saint-Domingue. However, behind the scenes, a series of factors would coincide to bring about the climatic stage of this conflict. Now, there were a fair amount of people in France who were basically just content to let Toussaint be. A lot of people in the army and whatever, just we don't really care that much about Saint-Domingue. But others had different ideas. Then Napoleon, as usual, would keep a lot of his views to himself while soliciting the opinions of others. Toussaint's former rivals, including Sontenax and André Rigaud, who are both back in France at this period, were basically just lobbying extensively against Toussaint, accusing him of tyranny and of subverting French authority, which he was absolutely doing.
Sure.
The white colonial faction, meanwhile, was pushing for an end to black rule entirely in the colony. Now, it also just so happens that Napoleon's wife, Josephine, had been born to a wealthy slave-owning family in Martinique.
Here we go.
And had relatives who owned plantations in Saint-Domingue.
And this is why you never listen to women.
In fairness, I don't want to be the evil harpy stereotype, because there's not much direct evidence that Josephine was influencing Napoleon on this issue. That being said, his wife is basically, slave owner family stock. It's probably gonna play some role.
Okay, let's not insult her for that and then call her stock. That's just a creepy way to call human beings.
Now, Napoleon himself had held very racist views towards the blacks.
Sure. And
disliked the quasi-independent status of Saint-Domingue under Toussaint. Napoleon's a control freak. He doesn't want people under him who are going around doing their own thing.
Makes him feel insecure.
Yeah. And speaking of insecurity, I think a lot of his racism also came in part from that. I mean, a part of it's, this is the 1790s, early 1800s. He's a European. I think a part of it also is he's a Corsican, and a lot of French people viewed the Corsicans as being half African, because race and ethnicity is very weird and dumb, and they looked down on the Corsicans as being these weird barbarians who are half African and whatever. I think a part of it's Napoleon proving his whiteness by being extra racist.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of racism towards Italians in that same vein. I know of it. These people got fucking 18th century, 19th century racism is fucking on another level of mind-boggling weirdness and stupidity. I don't even know where to start. I'll never forget my dad. I'm 15, and he's telling me about how he was a kid. They tell Polak jokes, and I'm like, what? I'm like, yeah, we make fun of people who are Polish, and I'm just like, what? To me, I couldn't even conceptualize. I knew nothing of the Polish people. I know no stereotypes, no positive or negative, no nothing, and I'm like, what? Why?
I had a friend in high school who would make a lot of Polish jokes, but he was also actually Polish, so he could give himself the pass.
Just remembering the one time I came into a Discord voice chat screeching about how I fucking hate autists because of some Twitter interaction I was having, and our mutual friend Bug has to quickly explain to everyone there who doesn't know me that I'm autistic and I get to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, that was fun. Or I don't get to. The question is, are you going to try and stop me?
No.
Alright. Ultimately, a series of 2 treaties would push Napoleon towards intervening in Saint-Domingue to restore direct rule. The first was the Treaty of Saint-Adolphe, signed in October 1800, in which Spain returned to France the territory in North America it had acquired from France back in the 7 Years' War. This is the territory most Americans know as the Louisiana Purchase, which has not happened yet. But when France took possession of it in 1800, Napoleon's immediate thoughts were not to sell it, but rather to use it as a means to strengthen France's position in the Americas. Napoleon dreamed of a new French empire in the West, one that would naturally include Saint-Domingue. He wants to threaten the United States and be far more important. The second important treaty was the Treaty of Amiens, signed in March 1802 between France and Britain following the end of the War of the Second Coalition. This treaty was important for Saint-Domingue for 2 reasons. The first was peace. Peace with Britain meant that France could now send a fleet of ships across the Atlantic without fear of it being sunk by the Royal Navy. The second was more complex, relating to the status of the island of Martinique.
Now, like Saint-Domingue, Martinique was a French possession in the Caribbean with a slave-based economy. This is where Josephine comes from. Unlike in Saint-Domingue, however, the slaves of Martinique had never been emancipated, as the island had been captured by the British prior to the Emancipation Decree of 1794. The British obviously had not implemented French law during the war, but with the Treaty of Amiens, Martinique was restored to France, and the question over whether its slaves would be emancipated now came up. Doing so would mean a loss in new revenue for the state, but maintaining slavery in Martinique would undoubtedly provoke further distrust of the French amongst Toussaint and his government. Ultimately, Napoleon decided to keep slavery in place in Martinique. Then Napoleon began assembling a force to invade Saint-Domingue as soon as the Treaty of Amiens with Britain was signed in October of 1801.
Pause. Doesn't this mean changing it? Like, he's not keeping slavery. The French government freed the slaves,
Yeah.
right? So this is a new policy. He's rolling back.
Yeah. We will get to that in a little bit because we're slightly out of chronological order. But yes, this is effectively annulling the decree of 1794. Yeah. This is why Napoleon gets the dubious distinction of being one of the few people in history to reinstate slavery in a country after its abolishment.
The anti-emancipator, if you will.
But yeah, so Napoleon begins to put together a force in around October of 1801. At the head of his army is General Charles Leclerc. Leclerc had joined the French army during the Revolution and had served under Napoleon since the siege of Toulon. He also was married to one of Napoleon's sisters, Pauline. Leclerc's second in command was the Viscount of Rochambeau, a member of the nobility who had served in the army since the American Revolution.
Wait. That Rochambeau?
No,
Oh.
I was about to say.
Okay.
If you're familiar with the Revolution, you know that Rochambeau, General Rochambeau, who assists the U.S., assists the colonists to a great extent. This is that Rochambeau's son.
All right. So let me get this straight. What we have here landing on the island is the brother-in-law of what is soon to be one of the greatest emperors of all time, and the son of a great general. Now, there have been good brother-in-laws, and there have been non-fail sons in history. Totally possible. But what do we have here? Like, okay. Before this,
this is the Nepo baby army.
Like, Leclerc, he's a general. He's fought before. How good is he? What are his stats? How do we feel? What's he putting up?
I mean, he's an average general who had never really held much in the way of independent commands. Some guy who, like, you could probably trust to carry out orders, but is not very proven in, like, coming up with, major orders.
I would not call him brilliant or creative.
No. He's not one of the marshals.
He's a paper pusher. He does what he's told. He has dutifully climbed the ranks, and he has seduced the sister of what is now effectively the king, and he's in a good spot. Is the Viscount proven at all?
Again, not really. Like, can carry out orders fine, but no independent command, no significant independent command history.
And suffice to say, neither of these guys have invaded an island before.
No.
So let's see how this goes. Leclerc had under his command a force of around 2,000 French regulars, most of whom were veterans of the fighting in Europe. He was joined by André Rigaud, who had fled to France following the War of the Knives. Okay, Rigaud knows what he's doing, knows the area. The orders Leclerc received called for a plan of deception. Oh, we're getting big brain here. First, he was to reassure the population of his peaceful intent. Saint-Domingue was still ostensibly a French colony. This is not an invasion. It's a reinforcement mission. And he would negotiate with Toussaint to allow the entry of French forces into the colony. Once that was done, he would drive a divide between Toussaint and his generals by giving rewards to the generals and affirming their status directly. He would then use both white regulars and black and colored colonial troops to put down any rebellion in the countryside. And once the colony was secure, he would arrest and deport all black officers back to France, disarm the black and colored military forces, and impose a white government. This is some white Yagami Frank Underwood genius plan.
It was kind of wild. Like, when you usually read about, like, military plans, they're generally, most of the time, they're pretty straightforward. Like, in movies, you often have, like, the 20 IQ, like, super strategic moves. Usually, it's just, like, invade island. Okay, we're going to land on this and this beach and move here and here.
What's weird
but,
is
like,
that
these guys were thinking, like, 5D chess.
Yeah, so what's weird is, each individual step does not necessarily sound dumb. In fact, like, I would say conceptually there's a lot of, like, good ideas going on here. Like, not trying to immediately fight, hiding your intent to enslave a bunch of people, dividing, buying off generals from Toussaint, like, getting people back to France away from their base of power. Like, good ideas. But when you, like, stack it all together, you're like, ain't gonna be that easy, is it now? The French hoped to arrive in Haiti as soon as possible so that the campaign could be fought in the winter and spring before storms and disease outbreaks of the summer. However, poor weather delayed the departure of their fleet until December 14th, 1801, and this in turn gave time for Toussaint, who had learned of the preparation from newspapers, to prepare. Garrisons and fortresses were fully manned, stockpiles were set up in the island's rugged interior, and muskets were distributed to the peasantry. We going to war.
Now, the French fleet arrived off of Saint-Domingue in February of 1802, and following a brief failed attempt at negotiating for their peaceful entry onto the island, they launched their invasion. So yeah, that 5D plan is already not really going well. They landed at Fort Dauphin to the east of Cap François and began massacring its black garrison. The black forces responded by retreating into the countryside after massacring many white civilians. These kinds of reciprocal atrocities would come to characterize the coming fighting.
My understanding is that the entirety of the Haitian Revolution, like, when this stuff happens, it's really fucking nasty. Like, heads on pikes, dismemberment. A lot of really nasty racial violence in this conflict.
Yeah. Now, that being said, even though the French plan was delayed and it wasn't going exactly according to what they expected, it was seemingly going pretty well. The black armies were forced to retreat and surrender, and several prominent black and colored officers switched sides. Most of the southern province, where the anti-Toussaint sentiment was still strong due to the War of the Knives, as well as pretty much the entire former Spanish half of the island, went over to the French with minimal fighting. Things were more difficult in the northern and western parts of the island. Here, Toussaint's generals set fire to Cap François and Port-au-Prince before retreating into the rugged interior to continue a campaign of guerrilla warfare against the French. Leclerc summarized the situation in a letter to Napoleon, stating, quote, "We are fighting an Arab-style war here. As soon as we have passed through, the blacks occupy the woods along the road and cut our communications." So yeah, your trademark, insurgency.
They have the cities, we have the countryside.
Yeah, but I think it is kind of interesting that, and it makes sense that, like I said, a lot of people didn't really like Toussaint by this point. And the last time the French were on the island with Frontenac, they weren't all that bad. Like, Frontenac was not trying to reinstate slavery. He was trying to make you cultivators, but Toussaint was doing the same thing.
So does Toussaint have, propaganda going on? Like, do they think that the French are coming to enslave them at this point?
Yeah. They, by now, not everybody thinks that. That's definitely what Toussaint's saying, and that's what, his supporters are saying. But not everybody fully thinks that. And I can very much imagine where if instead of Leclerc you had Frontenac backed by 20,000 men, this could work. Because, Frontenac was, not going to do what Leclerc does. But of course that wouldn't go along with Napoleon's orders, so such a thing would never happen. But if the French had just been we want to rule the colony directly, but we're not gonna do anything super evil relative, comparatively speaking, I think they could have pulled it off, really. At least in the short term. I don't think in the long term their position in Haiti was sustainable. But in the short term, I think it could have worked.
And there's even the play of overturning the authoritarian rules that.
Again, like you mentioned earlier, Toussaint's rules on agrarian policy were basically the same as what Frontenac was saying.
It's always amazing how it's kind of like, oh, this is going to be the weirdest fucking analogy, but Ruby Ridge, okay? What happened, you have a white supremacist fascist organization. You identify a guy who doesn't seem to be as crazy as the rest of them. You want to get that guy as a mole. Now you see that this guy lives in complete poverty, desperate poverty, and that they're only really interacting with these white supremacists partly because they're the only other people out here in this patch of nowhere that you move to because your schizophrenic wife is having visions from God. This is where she needs to be, on top of a mountain. And instead of making a deal to that guy, giving him some money to be an informant, talking to him like he's a human being, no, what you do is you entrap him in some trumped up firearms charges and freak him the fuck out, give him the panic, and people end up dead. There is an easy, better deal to be made here to the people of Haiti. But no, we have to go with force.
Yeah.
So it's unclear how involved Toussaint was in coordinating the resistance to the French. At the very least, it's clear that his generals, most notably Christophe and Dessalines, were playing an increasingly large role. Dessalines made a name for himself as a brutally determined leader, grimly resisting the French in several battles. Side note, Dessalines is often painted as the hyper-violent, brutal, because he came from, I think, he was a field slave, as in contrast with Toussaint being a house slave. This is mostly fucking a silly, ahistorical. It's not fully a lie, but it's painting a false equivalencies and whatnot. Dessalines had moments of brutality in his career, moments of utter political genius in his career, and is in many ways just as important a figure in Haitian history as Toussaint. He's often painted as the savage.
I mean, we'll maybe get more towards it at the end, but Dessalines is more popular than Toussaint in Haiti today. Mm-hmm. He is, Toussaint's the figure I think most foreigners know. I knew about Toussaint before I knew about Dessalines, but Dessalines is the big guy actually in Haiti.
It was thus seemingly a sign of France's inevitable victory when Christophe and Dessalines switched over to the French side in April of 1802. Isolated and betrayed, Toussaint was forced to surrender the following month. While Leclerc made assurances of his safety, he subsequently arranged for Toussaint to be arrested and deported to France in June. Toussaint would remain a prisoner in France the remainder of his life, dying on April 7th, 1803. Even in prison, he remained defiant, predicting that the French would be expelled from the island. And again, there was not a lot of weeping for him on the island because of the policies that had gotten him betrayed. So, French did it. They retook Leclerc. They retook the island. I really misjudged these guys. Of course, I mean, again, they let the black generals do the work for them, but it's fine. It's fine. They got it done. It's all great, right, Jay?
Yeah, no, it was going well. Leclerc even wrote to Napoleon saying oh yeah, we're pretty much, mission accomplished. All the black commanders are coming over to our side, and it's going well.
We do the fucking Napoleon on the man o' war with a mission accomplished banner.
Now, that being said, even though, by June you had seemingly the capitulation of organized black resistance.
The end of combat operations in Saint-Domingue.
Yeah. It turns out that there were still a bunch of guerrilla fighters in the countryside who kept on striking at the French. And this meant that fighting was still ongoing by the time of the arrival of the dreaded summer diseases. By May, Leclerc reported to Paris that only 12,000 out of his original 20,000 men were still fit for combat, with over 200 falling ill per day.
God damn.
By June, yellow fever had broken out amongst the French ranks. With his own forces weakened by disease, Leclerc was forced to rely even more on the black officers and soldiers to defeat the guerrilla fighters and disarm the population. Now, for a time, they made a show of doing this, with Dessalines being so vigorous in his efforts that he earned the nickname the Butcher of the Blacks from Leclerc.
Oh God, I'm just reading the symptoms of yellow fever. This is nasty.
Oh yeah, it's nasty. Yeah.
A lot of vomiting, sensitivity to light. Oh God. You just paralyze you. And then there's the toxic phase. So that's always fun.
It's one of those things where, when you get it, you flip a coin and, you're gonna die. It's hard. Some people recover from it, but not many.
It's like one of those things where people tell you to hydrate.
Yeah.
It's like, well, try to drink water and maybe you won't die. Good luck.
Yeah.
God bless.
Now, just as he was relying on black soldiers to secure his rule, Leclerc began implementing a policy of reinstating white rule in Saint-Domingue. André Rigaud was sent back to France. This pissed off a lot of his colored supporters, who had initially viewed rule by the French as being better than ruled by Toussaint. The final nail in the coffin, however, would come in August, when news reached Saint-Domingue of Napoleon's decision to annul the 1794 Emancipation Decree and maintain slavery in Martinique. Yeah, this is why I said we were kind of going out of chronological order, because it's 1802 where this will happen, where Napoleon will formally say, yeah, we're keeping slavery. That decree that the National Convention passed ending slavery, that's not a thing anymore. Now, Napoleon technically didn't order that slavery was to be reinstated in Saint-Domingue, but the possibility of such an occurrence was clear to everyone. Now slavery is legal again. Leclerc's trying to establish white rule. You can put two and two together. And because of this, Leclerc's colored and black soldiers and generals began to betray him in droves, melting away into the countryside to join the remaining rebels.
Abandoned by his black and colored forces, and his white soldiers dying of disease, Leclerc came to view genocide as the only solution to the problem he was facing, which I find funny because something is wrong with my brain. It's just, like everything goes his way, and the fucking privileged prep kid is just like, kill them all!
Pretty much.
Right in Napoleon of his attempt to kill all the blacks in the mountains and half of those remains in the plains. Luckily, he did not have the forces to carry out such an order, though massacres of the remaining black populations of the cities controlled by the French took place. By November 1802, Leclerc was dead, another casualty of yellow fever, and Rochambeau succeeded him in command. Opposite to Rochambeau was Dessalines, who quickly established himself as the leader of the rebel forces. Dessalines was a forceful leader, more blunt and aggressive than Toussaint. Whereas Toussaint sought to allow a white presence on the island to remain, Dessalines told his men that they no longer had any need for the whites. He did, however, recognize the importance of securing the support of the colored population, and thus gave control over the severed provinces to colored generals who had opposed him and Toussaint during the War of the Knives. It was in 1803 that the rebels created the first version of what would become Haiti's flag by removing the white from the French tricolor and leaving just the red and the blue. I think it may be apocryphal. I'm probably getting the story partially wrong, but there's like a legend that Dessalines himself did this, and he said, the blue represents the blacks and the red represents the coloreds. We don't need the whites, and we're bringing the two together. And that was the sort of theoretical, the sort of philosophy on which the nation was built. For the first time since the start of the uprising, it was clear that independence, not a different form of governance under France, was what was being fought for. It's interesting that, obviously probably things would have developed and they would have thrown off the colonial yoke regardless, but really up until this point in 1803, they are not expressly asking for independence from France.
No.
It's taken 10 years to get here.
Yeah. And that's why I said, if the French weren't all in on, genocide and white supremacy, it's not unfeasible that they could remain in control of Saint-Domingue for a little bit longer. I think it would have gone independent eventually, but it could have been, they could have done a better job of it, the French. Yeah, the winter of 1802 into 1803 did bring about some respite for the French, but this proved to be short-lived. Yeah, they did receive some reinforcements, and because of the winter, yellow fever kind of died down a bit. But Rochambeau kept on requesting more and more men and supplies because he needed it, and these requests were being ignored by Napoleon. The reason was fairly simple. Whatever Napoleon's views on Saint-Domingue may have been, By the end of the year, it was clear that war with Britain was on the horizon. The Treaty of Amiens had failed to bring about a lasting peace, and in May 1803, Britain declared war on France and also blockaded Saint-Domingue, which prevented any hope of reinforcement.
That's going to be a whole nother podcast, isn't it?
Yeah. The Treaty of Amiens is like a funny thing where it's like people are like, Britain remained at war with France throughout the entire period. And like even I've said that. It's like, it's technically not true because he did have this treaty, but it only lasted a year. Yeah. So, the British are blockading the island. The French are, screwed. This basically meant that defeat was inevitable. One of the interesting things about the Haitian Revolution is that we've talked so much to get to this point, but it really just is a case of things suddenly going bad for the French in a way that they can't pull out of, where it's like up until like June of, 1802, it's like they're winning on paper. And then, without the hope of reinforcement, disease just decimates them and they're done.
Are there any big, like, staged... We've talked about some city sieges. I imagine there are probably more pitched battles than, say, like, the War of the Knives or the ousting of Toussaint. But are there like, really any sizable battles besides, like, skirmishes in this war? Or is it mostly just bleeding them dry?
There are some battles early on, which the French generally won in their initial invasion, and there'll be a few battles in a little bit, but it's mostly skirmishes. But there are a few battles here and there.
And we still have those hit and run tactics and that bush warfare we talked about in the first episode. Did any of your readings kind of tell you about like the sort of tactical brilliance of Dessalines, or what characterized styles of warfare that might be worth highlighting?
A lot of it was just how he's very brave and very resolute. There's a battle early on in the French invasion where like Dessalines is in charge of defending a fort, and the French outnumber his forces significantly, and they launch like wave after wave an attack, and Dessalines and his men hold out again and again and again. And finally are able to retreat in the end, but they bled the French, dry for that
kind
conquest.
Of a Bunker Hill scenario.
Yeah, and the people who observe that see that like Dessalines is a guy who will stick it out to the end. He is somebody who is, and a lot of people, a lot of his comrades were like this, but he's just. He's very resolute in his opposition to the French.
And one thing you have to remember about these fighters is these are not European fuddy-duddies who, whatever side they're on, say, GGWP at the end or even if they're like taken prisoner or being held in, fancy schmancy. This guy was sold in slavery, escaped that. If he loses, he dies. Everyone he knows dies. Everyone he loves dies. That or go back to slavery. There is no defeat for these people.
Yeah.
This is what they have. This is what they are.
Yeah.
If they want to continue being free, to love, to joy, to have kids, to protect their loved ones, they have to fight for it.
Yeah.
Defeat is not an option.
Yeah.
And that is a factor that I think is ignored too often in history of people who had their backs against the wall.
Yeah, this is why it is good it's generally good policy in warfare to take prisoners and treat them all right, because that makes people more likely to surrender rather than fighting to the death.
You do not want them to do that.
Yeah.
It produces what we might call grit.
Yeah. Now, with defeat inevitable, Rochambeau abandoned the countryside altogether in favor of concentrating his forces around the cities and setting about on a policy of terror. Black and colored civilians and prisoners were massacred en masse, drowned in the sea, torn apart by dogs, and even gassed. Rochambeau came up...
I'm sorry, how do you do that in 1803?
Rochambeau actually, or at least some guys under him, came up with this idea where you put a bunch of prisoners on a ship and you set I don't even remember exactly what they would set on fire, but they would set some stuff on fire that would just produce a nauseous gas.
Carbon monoxide poisoning?
Yeah, and just, make, have this gas build up in the holds, and you just gas all the prisoners.
Fuck. We didn't go tons into it, but the execution styles in Saint-Domingue when it was a slave colony were equally horrifically creative. And
yeah,
at least he had some ingenious in one thing.
And Rochambeau will do a lot of times. It's kind of seeming like a weird tangent, but a lot of times when you're seeing discourse about movies or media, like Star Wars or whatever, people will be like, "Oh, the villains in this aren't realistic. They're cartoonishly evil. Nobody's that kind of evil." Rochambeau is one of the guys who proves that humans can be more evil than cartoonishly evil.
Well, you have to remember think about why he does this, and this is a guy who thinks that he's racially superior, he's class superior, that he was bred for and raised for stuff better than these people who are beating him. And so when he's losing, he is using these acts of cruelty. I don't know the man. I don't know too much about the man. Maybe there was a sadism in his heart, but if anything, it's a desire to reassert control, to say, no, I really won, and I'm going to prove that by being as violent and cruel as I can be, even though in aggregate I am losing.
Yeah.
To feel like a big man, like I'm as big as my daddy.
Yeah. I think, he is, even for the standards of the day, probably something, messed up with him. He straight up did a thing where he invited a lot of colored women to a ball. And when they arrived, he just showed them into a room where he had the dead bodies of their husbands and sons. He was, not a great person. But yeah, speaking of which, as the whole thing is falling apart, Rochambeau and his men are throwing these elaborate balls and parties in Cap Français, kind of reveling in a sort of doomed atmosphere surrounding the city. It's one of those where it would have been very surreal, I imagine, to be, and very bloody to be in that, where you just have these guys.
It's like Assassin's Creed video game ass shit.
Just partying during the end of the world sort of stuff. One of the sources from this is actually a French lady who wrote about it after the fact. And she was also notable because she was in an affair with American Vice President Aaron Burr. So it's kind of a weird thing.
Listen, I'm going to talk. That treason dick be good.
Yeah.
As a person who definitely totally doesn't plan to do any treason against the U.S. government, I would speculate that treason dick be really good.
Yeah. Now, Port-au-Prince was finally abandoned by the French in October of 1803, leaving Cap Français as their last holdout. Now, this would end up being one of those battles that actually takes place. It took place in the outskirts of Cap Français between Rochambeau's men and Dessalines. It was basically, Dessalines arrives and begins to lay siege to the city, and the French come out and meet him in a pitched battle. They sort of fight for a little bit, and then the French just surrender. I think it was really for the French more of just making a show of putting up a fight.
Yeah, you gotta say we got our licks in.
Yeah. So Rochambeau surrenders to Dessalines in November of 1803, and Dessalines agrees to allow the French forces to depart aboard the British ships that are blockading the harbor and be taken to England as prisoners. And that's that. That ends the Clerk-Rochambeau expedition.
3 days after Rochambeau surrendered, Dessalines had 800 French prisoners of war who had been too ill to evacuate the island put to death, a violation of the terms he had reached with Rochambeau. Though, you kind of have to also remember what Rochambeau was doing on his end.
Yeah.
This violence would set the tone of Dessalines' brief rule. Throughout early 1804, he personally oversaw the near-complete extermination of the remaining white population of the colony, moving from city to city to ensure that his men carried out his order. Men, women, and children killed all the same. This is what happens with blood. It just makes more blood, people. This is what happens when people are raised and grow up in brutality. They become brutal. Dessalines made sure that both black and colored soldiers did the killing, so that neither group could purport to be uninvolved with it.
Yeah. In particular, I think he was worried about, like, the colored population might, like, use this as being like, oh, we're not, like, barbarians like the blacks. Like, no, he made sure that's like, no, you are a part of this. Mm-hmm. And, a part of Dessalines' politics is that he does more than Toussaint did to, like, make the blacks and the coloreds one faction. And, the massacre of the whites is a thing where white, after the fact, white, journalists and whatever would play it up very much. It is real. It's a real thing that happened. Yeah. It's also very, like, I've sort of been of two minds of it, because on the one hand, again, like, Dessalines grew up a slave. He grew up being whipped by white people, seeing his, friends and family abused and killed probably. And it is totally understandable, I think, why you would hold that hatred of all white people. And, on an individual level, should children be killed? Obviously not. But you can't have much sympathy necessarily for, a white society that had, ruled this island for years in a way in which a third of, like, all slaves died, like, every couple years. On the other hand, I think this is also worth mentioning, is that a lot of Dessalines' men don't want to carry out his orders.
That's very interesting.
Especially when it comes to killing women and children. He has to go in person to make sure that they do it. There was hesitation. Not always.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense, actually.
A lot of them were totally fine with it. But there was hesitation, at least amongst a significant part of his soldiers, to fully carry out his orders.
I mean, obviously, bad comparison, but if you're just purely looking at the killing of civilians, I have a little bit of studying into the early stages of the Holocaust, and the Germans ran into the problem early on that most of their soldiers didn't want to just shoot people. They had to, they had to find some of the more nastier guys to do it, and then they had to sort of, the whole reason the gas chambers existed was to be a more dehumanized, less personal way to do it, because most people just, and this is a good thing, most men do not want to be handed a gun and put a bullet in a kid's skull. They just don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And it's hard to make them.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in the end of the day, I think we can say that we can understand where Dessalines and the other people who held this view were coming from, but also it's not that every single, Black Haitian was immediately just like, yeah, let's kill everybody, every white person we can get our hands on.
And this is what's fascinating about actually learning about history instead of all of the dates and shit they teach you in schools. Everyone says, oh, you should judge them by the standards of the time. You judge them by the standards of the time. For every single person that someone says you have to judge them for the standards of their time by, there was somebody at their time who was like, you are a fucking monster.
Yeah.
There were people in 1804 who did not want to do what Dessalines wanted to do. And I think that's very important to note.
Yeah.
That by the standards of his time, he was a butcher.
Yeah. Now, in 1805, Dessalines promulgated his written constitution, declaring himself Emperor of Haiti, thus making himself an equal to Napoleon. The new name of this new nation was taken from the old Taino word for the island. The Constitution also declared that slavery was forever abolished in Haiti, and that all Haitians would be regarded as one single group, blacks. It also kept the same forced labor laws from the Toussaint years. Now, by the end of the Revolution, up to a third of the colony's pre-war population, most of which, we're talking about are blacks, had perished.
Damn.
Now, the majority of the around 30,000 whites had left the island during the years of violence, but it's also estimated that up to a third of their group died as well. If you're looking at specifically the French invasion force under Leclerc, that also ended up numbering around 30,000, and of that, only 7,000 or 8,000 survived. Like 22,000 died, mostly of disease. In 1805, Dessalines launched an invasion of Santo Domingo, where French forces had remained after Rochambeau's surrender. However, he was forced to retreat when the arrival of French ships off of Haiti sparked a fear of a new French invasion. This fear would turn out to be false.
Dessalines' authoritarian nature had served him well during the Revolution, but proved to be his downfall once peace had arrived. Several of his generals, including Pétion and Christophe, came to resent his dictatorial rule and plotted for his assassination. Hard times make hard men. Hard men, you don't always want to keep them around. In Dessalines' case, very understandable. In October of 1806, Dessalines was ambushed and killed by the conspirators while traveling back to Port-au-Prince, his body literally being torn apart by an angry mob. The fall of Dessalines brought about a return of internal conflict in Haiti, as the nation soon split in two, with the north becoming a kingdom under Henri Christophe and the south a republic under Alexandre Pétion. Christophe's government began to trade with France, Britain, and America, allowing for it to rebuild at least a part of the country's economy. Christophe relied heavily on forced labor, however, leading to his unpopularity and eventual downfall. The North and the South were unified by Pétion's successor, Jean-Pierre Boyer, in 1820. Boyer would prove to be the longest-lasting of the revolutionary leaders, serving as president until 1843. It was during his time in office that Haiti was forced into an infamous debt agreement with France. In 1825, in exchange for formal recognition by France, Haiti agreed to pay an indemnity of 150 million francs to compensate for French property destroyed in the Revolution. And as we spoke about in our last episodes, it is this debt that has maligned, sickened, and beaten down Haiti even to this day. Because the West was not competent in recognizing who spoke for freedom. I think the last thing I'd like to talk about, because this episode is running a bit long, just at the end, is to rewind a bit and look at the bigger picture, because this is a part of our French Revolution series.
Yeah.
Napoleon had plans for a grand American empire in the Western Hemisphere. And the Haitian Revolution completely smashed those plans.
Yeah, and this is why he will, this is a big part of why he will sell Louisiana to the United States.
Black freedom fighters in Haiti are partially responsible, arguably completely responsible, for a third of the American landmass.
Yeah.
Pretty fucking wild.
Yeah. And back in Europe, Napoleon is able to kind of cover this up. By this point, he has a pretty strong amount of control over the press. He's able to downplay the defeat. French victories in the War of the Third Coalition, which we'll talk about when we do that, are able to distract people from this. So I think this is why, at least in Europe, the Haitian Revolution almost kind of gets forgotten. And it doesn't go down in history as one of Napoleon's big defeats on the par with Spain and Russia. When really, on the one hand, Napoleon wasn't there himself personally. But on the other hand, you can see how a lot of the same mistakes he makes in Haiti, he will make in Spain, especially in Russia to an extent. And you can see how the sort of arrogance, the sort of sending orders for people to do from afar without really understanding the situation on the ground. This will be a part of, the hubris that will lead to Napoleon's eventual downfall down the line. And yeah, it's, these are just some of the reasons why the Haitian Revolution is hugely important. I know we talked about this last episode as well, but it is worth, reiterating that, like, one of the reasons why Haiti is the way it is today is that even after the revolution took place, most countries in the Western Hemisphere kind of just sidelined Haiti. Like, some of them were traded with Haiti, but, like, did not recognize its existence and were very reluctant to engage with it in formal, relations until the French, recognized it in exchange for that 150 million francs of debt.
I've heard it told that when Napoleon was reflecting on the island of I don't know what I don't care at the end of his life, he spoke of this as one of his great mistakes.
He did, yes. And he even said that, he could have, joined with Toussaint and led an army of French and black soldiers to invade the United States. This whole thing was one of his big regrets. And, I believe him about that. I don't think it necessarily came from a moral, area. I think it just came from him, it was like, I lost. He's smart enough to recognize that. But yeah, he did say that this is one of his biggest regrets.
All right. I think that's, Jay, we got anything else to say?
No, I think that's about that.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. I do not want this podcast to be any longer because I'm the one who has to end it. So it is ending here. Goodbye, good night, go home, go get laid. Yeah.